it is great to have such a distinguished guest here with us today. So as Andrew mentioned, I'm Alexandra Chinchilla. I'm an assistant professor in the Center for Grand Strategy. And I'm very pleased to introduce Ambassador John J. Sullivan. He is currently a partner in Mayor Brown's Washington, D.C. and New York offices and is co-lead of the firm's national security practice. It's actually where he began his career, or near the beginning of his career. And he is also a distinguished scholar at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, institution dear to my own heart, and is a distinguished fellow at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. But what we're probably all very excited to hear about tonight is Ambassador Sullivan's accomplished career in public service. And I'm just going to list the highlights here because there is actually a lot. He served as Deputy Secretary of Commerce under former President George W. Bush until 2009. As a result of that and Bush 41, he does speak fluent Texan, so we can test him out tonight. From 2017 to 2019, he served as U.S. Deputy Secretary of State under President Trump's Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. And in 2019, he was appointed U.S. Ambassador to the Russian Federation. So that means that he had a front row seat to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, which I am really excited to ask him questions about. But he's also written a book on his experiences as ambassador, which is titled Midnight in Moscow. It's just been released, and I am told that after the talk, he will be available to sign copies. So I will be picking up a copy, and I'm sure everybody else, we can continue the conversation via a book. So Ambassador Sullivan, thank you so much for being here with us today, and I'm excited for this fascinating discussion. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Sullivan.
I speak here for...
I think so.
I think the run of show is that I speak here for, yes, a few appropriate remarks like Lincoln at Gettysburg. I will keep them brief, and then we'll, I hope, spend more time on your questions. Thank you for that kind introduction. It's an honor for me to be here at this library, at this school. This is my first event on my book tour, which when I signed a contract to write the book with Little Brown, they cared more about whether I would go out and promote the book. Could I do it? Would I do it? And what I've discovered now is the book tour is much more taxing than writing the book itself. But it's important to me. I can't say that it was completely by my design, but it's certainly my preference. This is my first event, in-person book event. I've done media in August. People are on vacation. The first book event is here. And I write about it in the book. My first job in the executive branch in government was working for President George H.W. Bush. And I write in the book about my affection for the man and respect for the man and what an influence he had on me as a young lawyer and public servant. I'm here to talk about Russia, about Russia's aggressive war in Ukraine. I went to Russia as the U.S. ambassador as a self-described Russophile. I had an open mind. I knew we had a terrible relationship. I was confirmed by the Senate in December of 2019. We had a terrible relationship with Russia at that time. The common talking point among U.S. government officials, diplomats, and folks at the White House was relations between the United States and Russia had really reached a low point in the post-Cold War era. Election interference, all of the Russian invasion of Georgia, the incursion into Ukraine, Crimea, and the Donbass in 2014, relations were really at a low ebb. My mission as ambassador was to try to find those few areas where we could continue to work with the Russians, and there were some. And there continue to be some to this day. For example, we've just announced, Roscosmos and NASA have just announced, we're going to send another American astronaut up to the International Space Station. There is still ongoing cooperation between the Russian Federation and the United States on space. Footnote. In the book, one of the themes of the book is nothing is ever easy with the Russians. Space cooperation, yes. Continuing, absolutely. The Russians have a consulate. Anybody here from the Russian consulate, by the way, in Houston? You laugh. I spoke last year at the Baker Institute, and there were two gentlemen in the front row wearing black three-piece suits who looked like they had just come from a funeral home, stood out on a college campus in the spring in that dress, and they turned out they were from the Russian consulate. Russia has a consulate here, and there is a large Russian presence also at the Johnson Space Center. Space cooperation, right? You ask your friendly FBI special agent, what the Russians are up to in Houston at the consulate and at the Johnson Space Center is not just the promotion of exploration of space. Some of these engineers and cosmonauts have additional duties assigned by the Russian Federation. I know you'll be shocked to learn that there are undeclared intelligence officers. And why does Russia want to have a consulate here in Houston? They need a platform. It's not that the few people who work at the Russian consulate here in Houston are themselves necessarily SVR officers or officers of the Russian intelligence services. But for those other Russians that they send into the Johnson Space Center or for other work here in the region on space issues, they need a platform to perform their other duties. So, yeah, we continue to cooperate with the Russians in space, but there's a cost to the United States. And that's one of the themes of the book. Nothing is ever easy with them. Everything we do with them is just shot through with distrust, mistrust, and bad actions. Another example. During the pandemic, there was the pandemic in Russia and in Moscow went in sort of a wave. There was a significant lockdown in Moscow, as there was in many other countries, in late March, starting in late March of 2020. But the Russian state, the Kremlin, Putin, needed that lockdown lifted, no matter what the health statistics showed, because there were two important things he needed to do that summer. He needed to have a 75th anniversary parade for what they would say is the Soviet victory, not the Allied victory, the Red Army's victory in the Great Patriotic War. And second, he wanted to have a referendum on constitutional reforms that he had proposed that, among other things, made the existing term limits under the Russian Constitution inapplicable to him so he could serve until 2036. So miraculously, the COVID situation clarified and improved on June 10th, 2020, so that exactly 2 weeks later, on June 24th, they could have their 75th anniversary Victory Day parade in the Great Patriotic War on Red Square, and the next day start voting on the constitutional referendum. In July, I am invited to a meeting with the Russian Minister of Health. Relatively recent appointee, I'd not met him before. It was my first in-person meeting with a Russian government official since the lockdown had begun in March. Over the course of the spring, many senior Russian government officials had gotten sick with COVID, many of them hospitalized. In fact, any senior Russian government official who tested positive was hospitalized, even if they didn't have symptoms. So the Russian health minister wants to meet with me. Of course, I'll take the meeting. And his pitch to me made a lot of sense, and I see how this strikes you. It made a lot of sense to me at the time. He said, we, the United States and Russia, need to cooperate in the face of this pandemic for the betterment of humankind. I need your help, Ambassador, in putting me in touch with officials at the Department of Health and Human Services, the Center for Disease Control, and National Institutes of Health. Our scientists, your scientists, need to cooperate for the betterment of humankind. Who's going to say no to that, right? Less than 48 hours later, I forget the news outfit that broke the story. Headlines in the United States and in the UK and Canada that the Russian security services were hacking scientific research on vaccines. Not just to try to give them a leg up on their development of what they call the Sputnik vaccine, but to foul up our research. And I read that, and I immediately thought to myself and talked to my colleagues at the embassy, how can I, with a straight face, call colleagues in Washington and say, hey, you want to cooperate with the Russian government that is hacking your research? Nothing's easy with them. Nothing is sacred, whether it's the Russian Orthodox Church, which is an instrument of the Kremlin, as is Aeroflot, the national airline, as is Roscosmos, the space agency, is really an instrument of the Russian security services. Despite all that, I still had an open mind, was looking for places where we could still cooperate. I wanted to be ambassador. I love Russians. I love the country, I love the history, the people. I've always been fascinated by it. I wanted to leave as Deputy Secretary of State to be ambassador to the Russian Federation for that reason, to try to find those few areas where we could work together, stop digging the hole we were in, and try to stabilize the relationship. Arms control, for example, another example of nothing is easy with the Russians. Fast forward to January of 2021, President Biden, President Putin have just started discussing the extension of the New START Treaty, the last major arms control treaty between the United States and the Russian Federation. Obviously, another important area where we, the two nuclear superpowers, need to have continuing discussions. The United States and Russia agreed that we would extend the treaty for 5 years. The treaty itself provides for a one-time 5-year extension by the terms of the treaty, ratified by the U.S. Senate. But nothing's easy with the Russians. I called the Kremlin. I had just gotten word from the White House. His first day, I think it was his first day. I think it was, in fact, the afternoon of the 20th. He's just been inaugurated. Instructions from the White House tell the Kremlin Biden agrees to a 5-year extension. It's what the Russians want. I call the MFA, the person I dealt with there most directly, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Ryabkov, tell him he's ecstatic. This is terrific. We'll get off to a new, good first step with the Biden administration. Okay. The thought occurred to me, I'd already been ambassador there for over a year, and the thought occurred to me in calling Washington back and saying, good news, Kremlin thinks this is great. I should have said, but nothing's ever easy with these people. A day or two later, Sergei calls me back and says, well, this is, everyone's so pleased that we're going to extend this treaty. It's such a good sign for world peace, controlling nuclear arms. We, the Russian side, will, of course, need to have the treaty ratified by our Duma and our Federation Council, in effect, their Congress, their parliament. And that may take some weeks. And I said, but Sergei, the treaty lapses on February 5th. And if the treaty lapses, then we can't just extend it. It doesn't exist anymore. Oh, the lawyers tell us we have to have the treaty ratified by the Duma and the Federation Council. So I said, Sergei, that's a significant problem. No one has ever said this before. Are you positive? Yes, absolutely positive. I said, well, then you're going to have to get it done before February 5th. Can't be done. You're being disrespectful. You're not respecting our process. Imagine my demanding that your Senate ratify the treaty by February 5th. They said, Sergei, our Senate doesn't need to ratify this treaty. But if you let it lapse on February 5th, then it becomes a new treaty, and our Senate will need to ratify it. And trust me, the behavior of the Russian Federation in over a decade since this treaty was ratified is probably going to change the vote count in the Senate. So you need to think about that. You're creating problems, John. Stop it. Cut to the chase. I knew that if President Putin wanted that treaty approved by the Duma and the Federation Council, all he had to do was snap his fingers. But they were posturing to say, we have a system like yours. You need to respect it. It's going to take time. I finally made the case as forcefully as I could that if they did not get this treaty ratified by their legislature by the 5th, that we would have no more arms control agreements between Russia and the United States. And I guess I was convincing enough that I got a call back. This is days before the treaty is going to lapse. And Sergei said, okay, President Putin is going to present the treaty to the Duma and to the Federation Council. Keep your fingers crossed. We'll see how this goes. I had a pretty good idea of how it was going to go, and it went like this. The treaty is presented to the Duma at approximately something like 10:05 a.m. At 11 a.m., it was ratified by the Duma. It was presented to the Federation Council at about 11:38 a.m., and it was ratified before noon. Astounding results. But my point of going for this digression is to say this was something that the United States and Russia wanted, both wanted. But nothing, from my perspective, is ever easy with them. Final point, and I like to turn, and the point of, I guess, of this event is the war and our engagement with the Russians before the war started. I'll begin this short story in June, I think it was June 16th, 2021, when President Biden and President Putin met in Geneva. I was with our president sitting across the table from Putin. And the United States side and the Russian side, the presidents discussed a lot of things. They barely discussed Ukraine, hardly discussed it. I've described this in the book, with how few sentences were uttered. There was much more conversation about Afghanistan and the pending U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan than about Ukraine. So we then, out of Geneva, out of that meeting, there are a bunch of work streams, areas again, coming back to my theme of areas where we're going to try to work together with the Russians. Strategic stability talks, arms control. We've extended the treaty. It's only good for 5 more years. We've got to start working on something to succeed it. Climate change and the upcoming Conference of the Parties, the COP meetings that were coming up. Wrongfully detained Americans, which was my area of responsibility, and cyber issues. There had been the SolarWinds cyber hack, and Russian experts and U.S. experts, law enforcement and intelligence officers discussing cyber issues. Those meetings were just starting. We're just getting going. When in late October, I happened to be home on leave, I was called to a meeting with the Secretary of State, who takes me into a briefing, a secure video conference with a presentation by the intelligence community about a massive new buildup of Russian troops and equipment on the border, Russian border with Ukraine and in Crimea. And that led to the intelligence community, which has it's difficult for them to come to firm conclusions on just about anything. They were pretty firm in their conclusion that what the Russians were doing now in the early fall of 2021 could only mean a large-scale invasion or re-invasion of Ukraine. President Biden sends the director of CIA, Bill Burns, to Moscow. I was in Washington. I went with the director, with Ambassador Burns. He conveyed a message to the very top and senior leaders from Putin on down. We see what you're planning to do. Don't do it. The response by the United States and the West will be devastating to Russia. This is crazy. Don't do it. The Russian response was, well, we have no plans to invade Ukraine, but yeah, sanctions, we don't like sanctions. We admit the Russian Federation isn't the economic colossus that the Soviet Union was. Sanctions hurt, but militarily, we're back. We've invested a huge amount of money and rebuilt and rearmed the Russian military. And so if there are any problems in our neighborhood, whether it's Ukraine or elsewhere, again, we don't have plans to invade. But if there were to be such problems, we can handle it. And whatever you want to do to us, knock yourselves out. It's not going to hurt us. So reported that back to the president. We then engaged in 4 months of attempted diplomacy by the United States with the Russian Federation to try to talk the Russians out of, deter the Russians from invading Ukraine. And in every step, the Russians were, as I said, nothing was easy with them. There was no diplomacy with them. Meetings, from my perspective, when I would go to meetings to talk about these issues, I would speak as I am now without notes. I'd have briefing books, which I had read very carefully. I knew what I wanted to say, but I wanted a back and forth. The Russians read from talking points. When I'd raise an issue, they'd have to go down, turn the page, number 37, and they would just repeat what they had said. This happened in every context in which we met. At the OSCE, at the NATO Russia Council, at the we had a bilateral U.S. Russia Strategic Stability Dialogue. There was no dialogue. There was no diplomacy. The Russians had a take it or leave it proposition, and this is how they presented it. Mid-December, I was summoned, and our Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, Karen Donfried, Dr. Donfried, and I were she was in Moscow. Summoned to the MFA, we were handed 2 draft treaties. One treaty was purporting to between Russia and the United States, and one between Russia and NATO. And they were really short. I don't speak Russian. They were only in Russian, which presenting just copies of these treaties to me and to Dr. Donfried, also not a Russian speaker, violated protocol. The protocol is when the United States presents a document to the Russian Federation, I present it in the official language of the United States, which is English, but we would always and have always conveyed a courtesy copy translated into Russian. And the Russians delight in taking our courtesy copy and correcting our Russian grammar. We'd spend meetings with, look, among themselves. They present these 2 draft treaties. They're 5 pages long. These aren't serious documents. Back in the day when people, before computers, when people would dictate letters and memos, there was an old saying of if something was riddled with typos, it was dictated but not read. So it was dictated to somebody, they typed it up, and then it just went out with typos uncorrected. These are sloppy drafts, dictated but not read, in Russian. And what's their proposal? This was a Wednesday. They said, we want to negotiate these treaties in 48 hours with the United States in Geneva. To which I said, do you know how long it's going to take me just to have these documents translated? And the United States is supposed to put together a negotiating team and be in Geneva, and it's now, by the way, less than 48 hours. Not serious diplomacy. Oh, but there's a public posture to this. They said, and if you don't show up, we'll make these documents public. It was all about public posturing. It wasn't about diplomacy. It was about creating a sense of crisis to justify what Putin had already decided to do, which was to invade Ukraine. And he finally explained, and we had meeting after meeting, extending into February, trying, as President Biden charged us, trying until the very last to avoid what we really knew by the end of January was coming. And in the last week, in the days before the war started on Thursday, the 24th, Putin gave three speeches, really, which explained his rationale for the war, which was first focused on Ukraine, that Ukrainians were committing a genocide against Russians in Ukraine, and he had to rescue fellow Russians from a territory that he said really is part of Russia. It isn't really an independent country. But the bigger problem from his perspective was that the United States, through aggressive NATO expansion east, and I'd like to talk about that later if you're interested, was really starting a war against Russia in Ukraine, using Ukrainians, fighting to the last drop of Ukrainian blood against Russia. And he launched an invasion, a large-scale invasion of Ukraine, and we've seen what's happened in the last over 2.5 years. Almost 15 million people either killed, wounded, internally displaced, or forced out of their country as refugees. The largest land war on the continent of Europe since May 1945. It was staged in a way, and I write about this in the book. I won't go into detail here because time is running short and I want to get to questions. Staged in a way that really mirrors the German justification for invading Poland on September 1st, 1939. Hitler claimed, again, Hitler, like Putin, a veteran of the Great War, Putin a veteran of the Cold War, a war that each leader claimed their country didn't lose militarily. It was a great stab in the back in Berlin and Moscow. In Moscow by the feckless communists led by Gorbachev, not the stalwarts like Putin, a KGB lieutenant colonel in Dresden, who were manning the battlements against the West. And the result of losing that war was that a phony border was created. For Hitler, it was a phony border in the East that separated ethnic Germans, his Volk, his people, his country. Prime Prussian heartland is now on the wrong side of a border with Poland. And the same thing happened in Russia. After the demise of the Soviet Union, the internal boundaries of the Soviet Union became international boundaries, separating Russia from Ukraine and leaving Putin's Volk, Putin's Russia, on the wrong side of that boundary. Manufacture false claims of a genocide against Russians. Hitler said it was Polish barbarism against his ethnic Germans in Poland that justified what the German government, the propaganda ministry, Minister Goebbels, forbade the German media from using the word war or invasion to describe what Germany did on September 1st, 1939. It was only after, on September 3rd, when the French and the British declared war, that the German media were allowed to call it a war. And of course, we've seen that now with Putin's euphemism for his aggressive war in Ukraine, special military operation. So I go to Moscow hoping to find a few areas where we can work together and actually engage. Nothing is ever easy with them, and it was impossible on Ukraine. Putin was going to do this. He was going to accomplish his objectives in Ukraine, which are to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. And either Ukraine was going to capitulate and a war wouldn't be necessary, or he'd have to resort to another euphemism that the Russians use, military technical means, which was the invasion. So I'll end there and look forward to taking your questions.
So please do write your questions down, pass them to the aisles, and the Bush ambassadors will pick them up. But let me just start by complimenting you on your tie, the colors of which are show a certain bias on your part, Ambassador.
Right.
Which I happen to share, actually. So. I should add a very parochial question here. I served in the Massachusetts legislature for 12 years, and the town, one of the 5 towns I represented, was Medfield, and John was just graduating from high school in Medfield when I was his representative for 8 years in the state legislature.
Never fixed the potholes, the streets of Medfield are terrible.
I was not a pothole guy. Anyway, thank you for being with that. Was brilliantly done, I have to say, and I am definitely going to buy the book. So let me ask, before we get the cards, a question that may be in the minds of everyone here this evening, and that is, what will it take for Putin to end this war? Is there anything that will end the war other than the collapse of Ukraine as a country?
If there's one thing he's been consistent in and hasn't lied about since even before the war started, it is his goals, Russia's goals, which, as I said, are to denazify, which means remove the democratically elected government in Kyiv, and demilitarize, which means not only eliminate Ukrainian military, demanding Ukrainian neutrality, and removing any choice the Ukrainian people might make for their own security. He will never surrender those objectives. He may be forced to agree at some point to a ceasefire, but there will never be, and he can never be trusted to agree to a more permanent arrangement in which he and Russia do not accomplish those objectives. I take that as my premise. So when people ask me, well, all wars end in negotiations. And I said, yeah, I guess when General MacArthur welcomed the Japanese delegation onto the Missouri in Tokyo Harbor and invited them to sign the instrument of surrender, I mean, maybe you could characterize that as a negotiation. Some wars don't end in the Korean Peninsula. The analogy I draw from my own ethnic heritage in Ireland is Ulster, is Belfast. And even if there is a ceasefire that the Russian military respects, Ukrainians and Russians are going to be whacking each other into the future. They're not going to be able to forgive and forget the war crimes that have been committed. Now the Ukrainian successes against Russia, and it's not just seeking the Moskva, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, or the black eyes that the Russian military has gotten in the war in Ukraine. But now the Ukrainian invasion of Russia, seizing almost 500 square miles of territory. The momentum of this conflict is making it more and more difficult over time to see an acceptable compromise. And one question to ask yourself if you're, and I am all for a negotiated settlement with a settlement that is actually acceptable to the Ukrainians. And when friends of mine, other, people I talk to all over the place about this, when they talk about negotiations and a settlement, it's always about things that the Ukrainians are going to give up. No one ever has a good idea about what is Putin going to give up. He's already declared that he will never surrender the territory that the Russian military has won in Ukraine. And oh, by the way, the Russian constitutional amendments that were proposed in January of 2020 and adopted, voted on by the Russian public in the summer of 2020, had a provision that people didn't focus on that carefully at the time, but that makes it unconstitutional for any Russian leader to separate the smallest bit of Russian territory, current Russian territory, for any reason. So Putin is constitutionally prohibited from surrendering territory that the Russians have now claimed. I am not optimistic about a solution to this conflict. Putin is more optimistic because he thinks that he can grind down the Ukrainians and the West, our patience and our ability to impose Russian aggression. And if it comes down to that, Putin's got a lot more resources that he can throw at this fight than the Ukrainians do. Final point, his resources are unlimited, however, which is why the Russians haven't been able to expel the Ukrainians from the Kursk region where they have successfully invaded Russian territory, giving Putin a distinction that he and Stalin share as the only leaders of either Russia or the Soviet Union who have lost Russian territory.
How far do you think Russia will go? They keep drawing red lines. Cross the red line, we'll use nuclear weapons. They keep making that threat. In fact, they made more threats of Putin has made more threats of nuclear weapons than the Russians did, or the Soviets did during the Cold War.
Right.
But obviously haven't used them.
Right.
Will they ever use them?
The honest answer is maybe. It depends on the circumstances. I'm sorry, I'm a lawyer. The lawyerly answer is depends. Let me point to what happened last year when Prigozhin had an armed force moving from Rostov to Moscow, not technically aimed at Putin, but seeking justice from the Ministry of Defense, the Minister of Defense, someone you, at the time, you knew and had dealings with when you were in government, and the Chief of the General Staff, Colonel General Gerasimov. If that were a Ukrainian column moving north toward Moscow, I could imagine a situation where, yeah, if he feels threatened, if he thinks that Russia is really going to lose its sovereignty, then nuclear weapons are on the table. Short of that, what Putin's doing, the analogy may not be completely apt. I think it was Willie Sutton who, when asked, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Why does he threaten nuclear weapons? Because that scares the hell out of people. And it causes us, the language that the academics use is to self-deter. I saw it happen in the Biden administration. Now, there's a rational reason to be afraid of nuclear war. There were two things that the Biden administration was most concerned about. The first was, and they both involve war with Russia. The first concern that led us, the United States and the West, to be slow in arming the Ukrainians was the fear that the Russians would strike the supply of weapons to the West via Eastern Europe, and to do so with strikes on depots, marshaling areas, etc., in Poland, Romania, et cetera, in NATO territory, which would then mean that NATO was at war with Russia. We didn't want that. No one in their right mind would. The second concern was that the Russians would use a tactical nuclear weapon if the Ukrainians were pushing back on the Russians, pushing them out of territory that Russia had controlled, either Russian territory pre-2014 or Crimea and the Donbass. I don't think it's rational, and I've had a lot of conversations with colleagues when I was in government at DOD, at NATO, at EUCOM, our military in Europe. It's irrational for him to use nuclear weapons, and I distinguish them from chemical weapons and biological weapons. Nuclear weapons destroy territory. Putin doesn't want to use a nuclear weapon to destroy territory that he claims as Russian territory in Ukraine. And oh, by the way, his bestie in Beijing, Xi Jinping, wouldn't be happy about that either. So I think it's unlikely in the extreme that he would use nuclear weapons unless there was a threat from Ukraine or the West similar to that column that was marching north to Moscow in June of 2023.
Parallels have been made in your comments between Hitler and Putin. What about Stalin and Putin? We did have one of the greatest Russia scholars in the West, Stephen Kotkin, the biographer of Stalin, here to speak. 250,000 people have watched his lecture on YouTube, his lecture here. It's the highest number we've ever had at the Scowcroft Institute since the founding of the school. It was an extraordinary audience. And his whole lecture was about comparison between Putin and Stalin. Do you think there's a similarity? What does Putin think of Stalin?
So I would agree with the professor's conclusion. I think Putin views Stalin through the lens of the Second World War and the victory in the Great Patriotic War. He was a defender of the Russian Empire. He reconquered territory that had been lost to the German invaders. But he's not an empire builder. Lavrov, the foreign minister, says that Putin has 3 advisors that he listens to: Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great. Stalin's not one of them, unless, except so there's the victory in the Great Patriotic War and in the internal repression of the Soviet peoples, plural, as we were schooled back in the 70s and 80s when discussing the Soviet Union, this enormous multi-ethnic empire, crushing internal dissent, which is what Putin is doing now, and is largely succeeding, has succeeded already, in crushing civil society, independent media, news organizations, either by arrests, people being forced to flee, executions, Navalny's poisoning, etc. So yeah, huge parallels between Putin and Stalin, I'm afraid.
I've heard some people say that the Third World War has already started. This is simply an early stage of it, 1938. It's not exactly the same as the First World War, the Second World War, but the number of people who have been killed, the casualty rates are unparalleled since the Second World War. Are we facing a world war?
We are facing a world in peril that is unprecedented in my lifetime, I believe. It does remind me, I am not a historian, but I believe you could draw parallels to the 1930s, to the interwar years, and not just with Nazi Germany, but with Imperial Japan. If you look at the geopolitical situation today, with the relationship between and among Russia, the People's Republic of China, Iran, and North Korea, that's a pretty formidable grouping of countries that is opposed to the global system, and I will define what I think that means. The so-called rules-based international order, which is the buzz phrase that my former colleagues and I at the State Department were instructed to use, American diplomats. The rules-based international order. What is the rules-based international order? I'll show you a great example that's relevant to this institution. Saddam Hussein, with grievances similar to Putin's grievances against Ukraine, invades Kuwait in early August of 1990. The rules-based international order, governed by the UN Charter and the UN Security Council, voted multiple times to authorize the use of military force if the Iraqis did not withdraw from Kuwait, authorizing the use of military force to expel Iraq from Kuwait. Now, we all know the history of President Bush, Bush 41, organizing this great coalition, 37 countries, 500,000 U.S. service members in the Gulf to push the Iraqis out of Kuwait. This wasn't an American undertaking. This was authorized by the UN Security Council. The Soviet Union voted in favor of every one of those resolutions, and the PRC abstained. The international system worked. It was 34 years ago. Now, the Security Council is, for all intents and purposes, with respect to, particularly with respect to Russia's aggressive war against Ukraine, completely ineffectual. What we're left with is the General Assembly adopting unenforceable resolutions, and this is the language that was used, deploring and condemning and ordering the special military operation, ordering the Russians to withdraw from Ukraine. A decision of the International Court of Justice, a UN court, not the ICC, not the International Criminal Court, but the ICJ. There's an American judge on it. That court voted 13-2 to order Russia to withdraw from Ukraine, to stop the special military operation. The two judges, there were 15 countries with 15 judges on the court, each from a separate country. The two dissents were the Russian judge and the judge from the PRC. For the remaining 13 judges who voted, it was 13-2, 13 that Russia needed to withdraw, 7 were from non-NATO, non-Western countries. You can look it up. I mean, it's Jamaica, it's countries from all over the world. The system doesn't work now because there's no means to enforce that. The Russians don't care. The Russians aren't going to do something because a court in The Hague issued a piece of paper that said they needed to do something. They don't care that 140 countries in the UN General Assembly condemned what they've done. The system, the international system that President George H.W. Bush relied on doesn't work anymore. We're going to have to work hard to try to defend, improve, build on, restore an international system, but it will be over the objection and without the cooperation of some very big and important countries, Russia, the PRC, and Iran.
Does the few months left in the Biden administration want to try to improve relations with Russia? Is that important enough to them that they're going to continue to restrict the use of weapons that we've provided to the Ukrainians in Russia proper? And why would that be?
Yeah, so, well, it originally starts with, as I described, the fears of war. President Biden had 2 instructions to his national security team. Do everything we can to support Ukraine and don't get us into a war with Russia. That led to the reluctance, the hesitancy to provide particular weapon systems or to impose restrictions on those weapon systems, particularly long-range strike systems, on whether they could be used to strike targets in Russia. Over the last 2.5 years, those restrictions have gradually been relaxed. My prediction is that they will continue to be relaxed, but to a point. As I understand, and obviously I haven't been in government in almost 2 years at this point, but from what I can tell and from conversations with colleagues who are still involved in these issues, it's really the United States and Germany that continue to have concerns about Ukraine striking the Russian, and I've never figured out when it's right to use motherland or fatherland. Putin uses them interchangeably, and I'm not quite sure. There must be a rhyme or reason to it. If the French have become very aggressive, that's an interesting case study, right? President Macron of France was trying to engage Putin in every conceivable way to talk him out of it, out of invading Ukraine. Now, he's willing to contemplate French soldiers on Ukrainian territory, assisting the Ukrainians in the war. My expectation is, and particularly in light of the Ukrainian invasion of Russia and what Putin has and hasn't done, is that the U.S. restrictions on what we will supply and restrictions on how those systems will be used will continue to be relaxed, but probably not at the pace that the Ukrainians want and deserve.
One of our students at the Bush School was on a internship in Europe this year, and it was a tour of the foreign ministries and defense ministries, and I said, repeat exactly what they said in the ministry in Berlin, the defense ministry. Senior official said, we have sufficient units to defend Berlin and one other city, and that's it. We cannot defend Germany against a Russian invasion if Ukraine should collapse. And I said, was he a little concerned about that? And the response was they were panicked over it. I've asked other people who visited, or Europeans who visited here, I said, is there any? There's always been a high sense of panic in the Baltic states, in Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and Romania, and Moldova certainly. But what about Western Europe? Is there a sense of panic that this could lead to an invasion that's far beyond Ukraine? What is you've talked to European diplomats?
Yeah, so I actually have a personal example. A few months ago, I was invited, my law firm has a large office in Frankfurt, Germany, and they had a big event, social event for clients, lawyers at the firm, big crowd, beautiful event, outdoors, gorgeous weather in Frankfurt. Everybody was happy, hors d'oeuvres, though, champagne, everyone's great, and I'm the keynote speaker. And what I said for my opening remarks here is basically what I said to them. And as I'm starting to speak, I can see shoulders start to stoop a little bit, like, oh, God. And I'm about 15 minutes into my stem winder, and everybody's like, oh. I get through my remarks, there are lots of questions, and the chairman of my law firm gets up, looks at this depressed crowd, the champagne glasses are down, and he's trying to revive the spirits of everyone, like, eat, drink, and be merry. It's only a few hundred kilometers. Oh, never mind, no, don't listen to what the ambassador. Yeah, there's very much a sense, particularly in Eastern Europe, and I saw this when I was deputy secretary, traveling to not just Tallinn and Vilnius and Sofia, but across Eastern Europe. This is before the war in Ukraine. They would say, with conviction and with cause, that they were already in a hybrid war with Russia. Russia was in a hybrid war against them. I'll give you an example. I was in Latvia, in Riga, and I was at a meeting with the foreign minister, and he was showing me on a map how the Russians would stage troop movements, exercises, near the Latvian border, and he drew it on a map. He said they'll load paratroopers onto aircraft, and they will fly directly toward our border, and before they get to the border, turn, and everybody in Latvia is going like this, right? And the Russians turn around. It's psychological, it's cyber, the Russian security services, the SVR, the FSB, it's really the FSB. The FSB, the KGB, when at the demise of the Soviet Union, the KGB was also reformed and split into a foreign intelligence service, which is the SVR, and the Federal Security Service, which is the FSB. The FSB is much larger, and it has, in particular, responsibility for the former states of republics of the Soviet Union, Russia's so-called near abroad. They are they've done a good job, particularly Eastern Europeans, expelling undeclared Russian intelligence officers, but it's a serious problem. But one final point that makes it even more complicated, and I saw this especially with Ukraine, the number of either Ukrainians or Russians whom I know who feel passionate on their side, whether it's pro-Russian, the special military operation, or in opposition, who have relatives on the other side of the border, Russians in Ukraine, Ukrainians in Russia. Putin's point about how closely related Russians and Ukrainians are is effective. It's bad history, as Professor Snyder at Yale has described it, but there's a grain of truth to it. I mean, the interrelationship of these Slavic peoples. In Latvia, a third of the population speaks Russian and it considers themselves Russian. The former head of counterintelligence for the FSB, who is now the deputy foreign minister in charge of counterterrorism for the Russian foreign ministry, was born and raised in Riga. And he joined the KGB. And by the way, when I say Aeroflot's an instrument of the KGB, he went to work for Aeroflot, which means he was working for the KGB. But that just gives you a sense of how familiar everyone is, but how threatened the people of Eastern Europe in particular feel with the threat that Russia poses to their country, to their freedom and their way of life. Final point, we haven't talked about NATO eastward expansion, which is not a reason for Putin to launch this war, the so-called the NATO march east. Among the criticisms of that fallacy is it completely undervalues, gives no consideration to the aspirations and security concerns of 100 million people in Eastern Europe. It wasn't NATO expanding east. It was 100 million people in Eastern Europe who had been crushed from the center in Moscow under Soviet repression and were looking west for security in the 1990s. And the Russians say, that's irrelevant. If we feel insecure and we feel threatened, that's all that matters. The fact that Czechs, Poles, etc., they wanted to join NATO, they can't make that choice because we feel threatened. And that's the argument they're using today against Ukraine. Doesn't matter what the Ukrainians think. Doesn't matter that the Ukrainians feel threatened by us. We feel threatened by them, and that's all that counts.
I might add one comment about Ukraine and Russia. Stalin imposed the forced collectivization in the early 30s. He killed 15% of the Ukrainian population and exterminated virtually the entire leadership, cultural and intellectual leadership of the country during the forced collectivization, which included not just starving people to death, but sending them to die in Siberia in the forced labor camps. How could you forget that? 5 or 6 million people died. And this was not 300 years ago. This was in the 1930s. The Ukrainians are supposed to forget that? I wouldn't forget that if I were Ukrainian. Anyway, I'm sorry I'm getting a little carried away here. I do want to thank you. We are unfortunately running out of time. Thank you for coming this evening. Thank you, Ambassador, for being with us. And you'll be outside to sign books, is that right?
Sure, absolutely. Continue questions and
Thank
the
you.
conversation.
Okay.
Thank you.